Hey, Scott,
Hey, Garrett,
remember that time I got in trouble for tweeting the Minnesota Orchestra?
which one?
Well, we'll get into a little bit of that today. It feels good to just go ahead and let all the tea out about some of my disappointments with our local
A
orchestras.
little cathartic, is it?
Yeah, how about we go ahead and get into it? I'm Garrett McQueen,
I'm Scott Blankenship.
and this is TRILLOQUY, true and real stories from the fringes of classical music. An excellent guest on this opus of TRILLOQUY, Sam Bergman, violist with the Minnesota Orchestra. He really spills some tea for us and digs into some conversations that honestly I wasn't expecting a member of that ensemble to engage. So I'm looking forward.
Why do you think that is? I mean, I know that we get into it, but what was your first thought as to why
Well,
he got into it, whereas others didn't?
you have to understand that APM and the Minnesota Orchestra sort of have a relationship, specifically Minnesota Public, classical Minnesota Public Radio, with the live broadcasts of
It's a
their
big deal.
of their concerts and all that. So of course folks get mad at me when I'm too critical of the organization in a public way. But Sam is critical of the organization in many ways himself. So I'm really thankful and grateful to him that he came in to engage some of the conversations about what organizations as big as the Minnesota Orchestra are doing to, change the tides, conversations they're having about inner leadership and all that sort of stuff. So, yeah, it's going to be great. But you've actually interviewed Sam before, I understand.
Yeah, and he didn't even remember it.
Oh.
So if that tells
That's
you anything
funny.
about the program.
Shade.
No, there was this program that I was trying to launch called Behind the Music Stand. And the idea was that I was going to interview members of orchestras who weren't the principal or who weren't the concert master, and so the conversation that we had circled largely around, he's got a garden and he likes to cook, and what bands was he listening to outside of classical music. So there was not much trill about it.
Yeah, that
at
was a
all.
colloquy, but this is triloquy.
Right,
Well,
right. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
One of the things that he brought up that I think that anybody not in the orchestra world will find interesting is the talk about auditions and that.
And I always forget about that.
Yeah. Because I come from a theater background, and it would be so strange for me to audition for a show without being seen.
Yeah.
I mean, they want to see you, and they want to see how you are going to interact with other people who might be on stage with you, because that's going to give the best product.
Yeah.
And he says that, the way he talks about it, that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, different orchestras do different things. Some orchestras keep the screen up the whole time. Most auditions I've taken, if not all, will have a piece of carpet on the stage, so you can't even hear if it's a woman's heels. I don't know if I told this story on the podcast before, but I was studying music, professional, like how to brand yourself. I forget the name of the class that I took at USC, but that's where my website came from, garrettmcqueen.com, all about branding yourself as a classical musician. Anyway, that teacher, and I'm forgetting her name right now, but she talked about how she was on an audition committee, and it came down to two. They were hiring a cello player, and it came down to two people, a man and a woman, and they ended up and they took the curtain down and ended up choosing the man. And the music director chose the man, because ultimately the music director makes those decisions, especially when it gets down to the nitty gritty. And right there in the open, after the candidates had gone backstage, someone said, "So why did you choose the man? Why did you choose such and such?" And he said, My wife would kill me if I hired someone that attractive." So you never know
Dang.
how little things can affect someone's livelihood. So that's why that curtain is important. The curtain came down for me in the finals. And I'll never forget, shout out to my homegirl, Ebony, who she was a principal flute of the Knoxville Symphony when I got there. She's playing down in Texas now, and she's black. And when I walked out on stage after the curtain was down, I'm looking out into the hall, and I see all of these people whose faces I don't know. And then I saw Ebony kind of smiling and nodding her head when she saw me come out, and I was like, "Okay, here we go."
Mm.
And as I say, when this conversation comes up and other things, I do panel discussions and all of that. Maybe they hired with diversity in mind. Maybe the best man won,
Mhm.
and maybe it was both.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a part of every bassoonist's experience is going out on that stage with the curtain up and playing this. And then in those 12 or 17 seconds, your fate is sealed.
Hangs in the balance.
And of course, that's not a tune by Rachmaninoff, despite what people see in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Is it that movie?
Yep.
It's the
Yeah.
the opening to the Overture to the Marriage of Figaro by Mozart. But yeah, Sam talks about auditioning and some of the other inner things. Not just the flowery garden talk like y'all had, even though that's important as well. Also a bit about his upbringing, how he transitioned from violin to viola.
Yeah.
And then at the end of this opus, we're going to hear a piece of music he brought in, right?
From Judd Greenstein, who is, I guess the Now Ensemble still does play together, but the members are scattered around the country. But yeah, check out the Now Ensemble. Judd Greenstein is one of the founding members and a guitarist, and he incorporates electric guitar into the Now Ensemble's music in a really creative way. And he wrote a piece for a violist that is backed up by 6 other violas. And yeah, and Sam goes into the reason, how it was written, and the performance that it was meant to have, meaning it was supposed to be a bunch of speakers scattered around the room.
Yeah.
So
For folks who have never heard of Judd Greenstein or the Now Ensemble, is there a piece of music that comes to mind for you immediately that sort
it's
of
called
defines?
Change.
It's called Change?
There's a piece called Change. It sounds like this. The Now Ensemble has a lot of really good tracks.
Yeah,
but
that's fun.
Change is a jumping off point that I think you'll enjoy.
Yeah. Well, okay. So before we get into the conversation with Mr. Sam Bergman, one thing we kind of touched on in the conversation that I want to touch on here, we'll have to find another time to get really more in depth with it, is the relationship between a principal voice and a non-principal voice. And what I mean by that is in orchestras, every time you hear in your favorite piece of music, you hear a flute solo, you hear a beautiful bassoon solo or whatever, that's being played by the principal musician in that section. The same that there are principal dancers in ballet, principal actors
A lead.
in theater, a lead. And sometimes, the relationship between the lead and the non-lead, musically and otherwise, can be a little tense. It has been for me over the years, and there's a very specific balance that you have to maintain. Shout out to Aaron Apaza. He plays with the North Carolina Symphony now, but he was principal bassoon of the Knoxville Symphony when I was down there. And, sometimes when it came time to play that piece of music with the incredible solo, right now I'm thinking about the second movement of Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony. It can I can feel away because I feel like I could play it as beautifully or whatever, but that's just not, my role. What's your experience with dealing with non-principal roles?
Loads of it in theater.
Yeah.
I mean, not everybody can be a lead.
Yeah.
And I'm a co-founder of a theater group, and I wasn't always cast in the lead.
Right.
And that's one of the things that we talked about with Sam, because I can't imagine having to read lines and not being seen doing it. But there's a quote that says, "There are no small roles, only small actors."
Yeah.
And that is crucial because the lead can't do the lead role without and do it well without the support of somebody who's only in one scene or
Yeah.
something like that. I was in a production where the review of my work was Blankenship does more with a few lines than some actors do with a whole script.
You bodied it.
So yeah, you know, and I think that you can create something just as important as whatever the lead person is doing, because they can't do it without you. And so
Right.
that's why everybody needs to be invested. There's no small roles.
And something when we were kind of talking about this last night around my dinner table, sometimes those smaller roles, those non-principal roles, can be what defines a work of art. And the example we had in mind was the Queen of the Night from Mozart, bringing Mozart up again from Mozart's Magic Flute. You know, when people think of that opera, they think of that character and that really legendary aria.
Absolutely.
Even though in this multi-hour opera, the Queen of the Night has exactly 3 scenes. One where she's telling, I like the first aria better, actually. The one where, you know, she's saying what has to go down, and, you know, mein Sohn, she's talking about Tamino, if you know the tale of the story, you know, where she's doing all these vocal acrobatics. And then later on, the second aria, the one that's really famous, where she's talking to her daughter about why she needs to kill this man that she's in love with. And then in her third scene, she's with her crew, the 3 ladies, as they're known, and I'm forgetting the character's name right now. He's described by Mozart as a black character, actually. In that scene where the sun comes out figuratively, you know, metaphorically, and the Queen of the Night and her minions are destroyed, you know. So anyway, a whole opera where this character shows up so few times, but it kind of defines the work of art. How about we listen to a little bit of that famous aria to transition into our conversation with Sam? Sam Bergman, it is a pleasure to have you here on Triloquy. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me. I'm a fan of the show.
Oh, thank you. Well, we have a lot to talk about today, all sorts of dramas within and outside of your employer. But I wanted to start by going to your Twitter. So that's actually how I started to know who you were and some of the things that you believe in when it comes to classical music. And I pulled this tweet of yours from December. It's actually a poll that you took on Twitter, and it says, what will ultimately be more irritating in the classical music world of 2020? 42% of the folks who took this poll of yours said endless Beethoven is going to be irritating in 2020, and 57.8% of the people who took your poll said endless bitching about endless Beethoven is going to be more annoying in 2020. Talk to me about that that sort of topic as it applies to your job. Is that something that is going on a lot in the men work? And
Well, first of all, did you vote in this poll?
I did not, because Twitter gets me in trouble often enough anyway.
Was voting closed?
Yeah.
You know, this is one of those things where I feel like sometimes music Twitter and the music world diverge into 2 different universes,
Sure.
right? Because 2020 is this big Beethoven anniversary year, 250th anniversary, and so, you know, every classical music institution and presenting organization is sort of falling all over themselves, either trying to just put as much Beethoven as possible on the schedule, or to figure out a way to observe this anniversary without doing that. Because, as has been pointed out, frankly, ad nauseum, every year is a Beethoven celebration year in the
seems like
world
it.
of big classical music institutions. Orchestras play his stuff I think it was Rob Deemer, the musicologist and researcher out of upstate New York, who put together a fantastic graph showing that one of the major reasons that we don't get a broader diversity of programming at orchestras is that a very small handful of composers are repeated a crazy number of times per season, and that Beethoven leads the field. I think he showed, I'm going to get this wrong, but I think his graph showed that the number of works being played by composers from historically marginalized groups, so women, people of color, all of that, was not quite equal to the number of works just of Beethoven's that were being played by the nation's large symphony orchestras, which is a crazy stat.
Yeah.
You know, and his point was not that we shouldn't be playing Beethoven. It was, if you just knocked one off, if you went from playing 3 Beethoven symphonies a year to 2 or 4 to 3, you've just opened up more slots that you could fill with someone else, and you would still be playing Beethoven. You would still be selling those tickets. No one, I don't know. Does anyone dislike Beethoven? I guess there are some people who at this point performatively dislike Beethoven.
Right, exactly.
And that goes to the poll that you talked about on Twitter. That was me being a jerk, basically. Because they, at this, you know the way Twitter is. If you're on Twitter, somebody makes a good point about something, someone else retweets that point, then 100,000 people retweet that point, and then everyone adds their own thing, and all of a sudden everything kind of flips, and the person, and like the good point being made is almost as irritating as the original thing it was pushing back against.
Exactly.
It's the business model of the platform. It makes it thrive, and at some point the anti-Beethoven stuff becomes almost as performative as the Beethoven stuff. So that was the reason I put the poll up. It was just for fun. Almost everyone took it that way. Inevitably, you know, on social media, somebody's going to not get that it's a joke and get bent out of shape. That probably happened. Honestly, it was more than a week ago, so I don't remember.
But you're no stranger to making people feel bent out of shape based on your social media.
Wait, what?
And, you know, and Scott, you can speak to this, you know, and so many of these, you know, professional jobs, quote unquote, you know, you're supposed to keep your social media nice and squeaky clean and uncontroversial, but you don't seem to have that concern at all, at least from my perspective.
No, I do have that concern.
Okay.
I mean, I think I speak freely on Twitter, and I'm very fortunate that I'm in an employment situation where I am largely allowed to do that. Nobody has ever called me in to talk about my Twitter.
Good for you.
Now, part of that might be that just in the world of symphony orchestras, I think that's much more of a Facebook world still.
Okay.
So there are fewer orchestra musicians on Twitter. There are only a few of my colleagues in my orchestra who are also on there, and we do follow each other, but we leave each other alone, largely.
Nice.
But I think I am careful to not ever assume that I am empowered to speak for my orchestra, because I'm not,
of course,
in any way, whether it's on Twitter or here or anywhere else. I am one person out of 98 just among the musicians. And it's absolutely not okay for me to act as if I speak for the Minnesota Orchestra. I don't any more than anyone else does.
I'm still going to ask you Minnesota Orchestra questions, though. Just fair warning.
That's fine. I am fully prepared to dodge them. It's going to be great. But yeah, it's, you know, I speak freely about the classical music world generally and my role in it, because that is a thing I'm empowered to speak about. You know, I've been in this business for over 2 decades now. I'm extremely old, and I have, you know, I've seen a lot, and I function both in the world of symphony orchestras, but also somewhat in the new music world. I have floated in the world of music journalism at times in my career. So I've had the benefit of getting to know a lot of different people with a lot of different perspectives. And that's what I like about music Twitter, is that we can get to know people from a lot of different corners of the music world far more quickly than used to be possible. I have all of these Twitter friends all over the world who do incredible things I would never have heard about, but for that platform. So I really value it. I know Twitter can be awful and everybody delights in talking about what a cesspool it is, but there are some really good parts of it. And it's that discovery that I think is my favorite.
There is some stuff that I wanted to ask you about on your Twitter that's that isn't controversial. What's a Mr. Big Bar? What?
This is from yesterday.
Right. So You had this picture of a whole cache of snacks.
Yeah.
A lot of it in French.
Yes.
So you drove to Canada
Yes.
for
Yesterday.
snacks.
No. Okay. That's not what happened. I crossed into Canada for snacks. I drove to, so for those, I assume most of your listeners are not from Minnesota. Everyone assumes that Minneapolis, St. Paul basically sits on the Canadian border. It absolutely does not.
Right.
The closest border crossing is a 6-hour drive almost. I had to drive up to that border crossing yesterday to do an interview for the thing they call Global Entry for, it's like international pre-check basically. They're hugely backed up. You would normally do it at your local airport. They have no openings. And I thought, it's a beautiful drive up the North Shore. I'll just go up there and do it. And while I was there, I crossed over to Thunder Bay to pick up snacks for my Canadian friends who work with me in the orchestra and who always want their favorite Canadian candy bars. You asked about Mr. Big. I have no idea what's in a Mr. Big because I have never had one. That is not one of my preferred Canadian.
All right.
It looks like it is a peanut caramel situation with chocolate, but not a Snickers. I don't know.
All right.
I was there for the all-dressed chips and the Oka cheese. That's my jam.
Okay, I'll have to check those out myself. I know about ketchup chips being a Canadian thing. But...
Very much so. All-dressed is like kick that up several notches. Just everything poured onto one Ruffles chip.
Oh man.
So you talked about these different worlds that you've existed in under the giant umbrella of what we call classical music. Where did it all start? Talk to me a little bit about young Sam and picking up the viola for the first time and all of that.
Sure. So I, like a lot of string players, I started very young and I started on violin, which a lot of violists do. My mother's version of this story is sort of the definitive one, and yet I don't trust it because in her version of this story, I read an article in the Boston Globe when I was 3.
You did.
I do not find this. I do not find this credible.
That's not the real origin story.
I think I saw a picture.
Okay.
I think I saw a picture of some Suzuki kids playing violins, and I wanted to do that. And my parents' position was, well, that sounds great, but last week you wanted to be a firefighter, so let's see how this plays out.
Right.
And they sort of let me fixate on it for a while, and eventually for my 4th birthday, I got a tiny violin. And they found me a teacher in our little town. We were living in Massachusetts at the time. And they found me a Suzuki teacher who was this absolutely wonderful woman named Genevieve Osborne, just one of the kindest souls you would ever meet. Her prized possession was a picture on her piano of her with Dr. Suzuki himself, the inventor of the Suzuki method, in her backyard where she had convinced him to come and see her class. And so I studied with her for a while, and I eventually was fortunate enough to catch on in the studio of Mary Lou Speaker Churchill, who was the principal second violin of the Boston Symphony, and also this legendary violin teacher. I mean, when you talk to people from New England, people from Boston, she taught just an ungodly percentage of the great violinists in that town. Just the kindest person, unfortunately passed away all too young, but left this amazing legacy behind. And so I studied with her, and when I was 9 years old...
Who is she, by the way?
Sorry?
Who was she, by the way?
Mary Lou Churchill?
Mary Lou Churchill. Okay, I want to make sure I write her name down.
Yes. So she, when I was 9 years old... I was her youngest and least advanced student.
Okay.
It was very
Did that come from her, or did you just feel that way?
No, it was just true.
Okay.
I mean, it was most of her students were teenagers. She was very kind to take me when I was 8 years old.
Gotcha.
I think she saw talent there, but it was certainly very raw, it was very undeveloped. I was still, making my way through the Suzuki books. She was very, very kind to take me.
Yeah.
And when I was 9, she invited me to come out to Tanglewood, the Boston Symphony summer home in rural western Massachusetts, and spend a week just living with her, having lessons every day, going to closed rehearsals of the Boston Symphony, playing Frisbee on the lawn at Tanglewood with the new young concertmaster of the Boston Symphony, Malcolm Lowe, who actually just retired. And it was this really transformational experience. I think up to that point, I loved playing the violin. I had never thought of it as a job that people did, although I guess I knew that it was. But
Sure.
That was the first time that I thought, oh, yeah, yeah, I would do this. This seems great, you
Yeah.
know. And of course, viewed through the lens of the Boston Symphony, yeah, any music
It would
world
be
job
great.
that sounds fantastic. My family moved to Pennsylvania the next year, and so I had to leave Mary Lou, and I had wonderful teachers in Philadelphia, the De Pasquale brothers, who were legendary members of the Philadelphia Orchestra. But I really kind of hit the back burner with music at that point. I was not super happy about having moved.
Mm.
I think I was the definition of a petulant preteen.
Yeah, Mom, get out of my room, all of that.
Oh, it was. The fact that they put up with me at all is just a testament to good parenting.
Well,
But
shout out to them.
yeah, no kidding. Yeah, but somewhere around this time, I also started to play viola, and that actually happened at a summer camp that I was going to in Western Mass called Greenwood, which is the nation's original chamber music camp, and it is this wonderful place that is not at all the sort of prodigy factory that you sometimes think of when you think of music camps.
Yeah.
It is very dedicated to the idea that the camp is there to provide kids with a growth experience tailored to them, that every kid should be able to have their own journey. Some of them are going to be professional musicians, most aren't, but they're all great kids, and you bring them together and you help them strive to sort of hit just above where their level was when they came in, you know, because that's such a great way to make kids feel like they've accomplished something. And I was going to this camp. I think this was sort of my parents' sop to me from the fact that we had moved. You know, was you can go back to Massachusetts to go to summer camp.
Right.
And I had a counselor one year when I was 11 who I did not like at all. And his name was Ken. And he did not like me. I think we were both right. And I annoyed him night and day, and at some point he went to the director of the camp and he said, "This kid needs more to do because all he's doing is annoying me. Could you give him a second chamber group next week on viola?" And she said, "Sure, we do that." And they came and asked me if I could read alto clef, the clef that viola reads in, and I had no idea what that was, so I said yes.
Like you do.
And that went very badly because they believed me and they put me in this group. And I literally was just guessing the notes all week. I sort of like had a vague sense of where things
That's
are.
what I do when I have to read alto clef. So.
Right? It's what everyone, it's like, you know, that middle C is the middle line of the staff.
Yeah,
And then you just
after
sort of,
that, we'll see.
right, you guess from there. And so, you know, so it went very poorly, but I did like playing the viola. And if I'm totally honest, the main reason I said yes is because there was only one kid in the camp that summer who was a full-time violist, and I had a crush on him.
Oh, every time. That's
And
always the story.
I somehow had it in my head that if I played viola, they were going to put me in orchestra next to Georgie. And then I was 11, so I don't think I probably thought through much past that.
Okay.
But I thought we would be and that's not at all what happened. But yeah, so I started playing viola, and the denouement to that story is that counselor who was directly responsible for me starting to play viola, Ken, his last name is Freed, and he is also a violist in the Minnesota Orchestra.
Oh, look at that.
He beat me here by about a year and a half, and he was on my audition committee.
Oh, wow.
And the best part was he told me that after the audition, he called another guy, a friend of his, who had also been a counselor that summer, and said, "Alan, Sam Bergman just won a job in my orchestra." And Alan said, "Ken, I'm sure that the statute of limitations ran out a long time ago, and I think you're going to be fine." So yeah, you know, the music world is so small.
Oh, yeah,
and we all have
definitely
those
is.
stories.
Yeah, and you know, something that a lot of folks, even within this world of classical music, you know, just can't quite wrap their minds around is the huge moment it is to win, not just win a job, but win a job in an orchestra as big as the Minnesota Orchestra. You know, when I won my job with the Knoxville Symphony, you know, years ago, I felt like I was on top of the world, like I had, you know, managed the impossible. But even so, that was a position that, you know, couldn't pay me to live my entire life. But with the Minnesota Orchestra, you know, that's a highly coveted position. Do you see yourself hanging on to that for the long haul, or is this just a period, or what?
You know, what's funny about that feeling that you describe when you win an audition is, so I started out in the Alabama Symphony in Birmingham.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
So slightly larger organization than Knoxville, but not by so much.
Right.
And also at the time, the Alabama Symphony had just come back from not existing for 5 years in the 90s. They literally went down and came back in 1997 as a whole new organization. And I joined a year later in 98. And I remember that feeling when I was told that I had won that job. And I remember the feeling when I won in Minnesota, and it was the same feeling.
Yeah.
It doesn't,
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
not better because it's a bigger job. You still have just that moment of incredulousness that they want you, right? And it's such a, and actually the only difference was in Alabama, actually in the case of both of the jobs that I've been fortunate to win, there were 2 jobs available.
In the Minnesota Orchestra.
In the Minnesota Orchestra and also the Alabama Symphony when I auditioned.
Oh.
So 2 of us won at the same time, which was great because then you're coming in with someone,
Yeah.
right? You know, and in the case of Minnesota, it was an incredible violist named Kerry Ryan, who's now in the Philadelphia Orchestra, is one of my best friends, just a great person. And in Birmingham, it was a woman named Ramona Merritt who I could not have asked for a better colleague to come in with. She had a little more experience than me, but was also young. And she had the experience, which meant that I was the one who said the dumb thing at the audition because we were sitting in the room and they had eliminated enough people that there were only 2 of us left. And in my head, that meant we were getting the jobs. And I said that at some point when the personnel manager had left the room. I sort of looked at Ramona and I said, so there's 2 jobs, right? And she said, yeah. And I said, well, so it's us, right? And she just looked at me like I was the dumbest thing alive and said, they could hire neither of us.
Right. And that's something else a lot of people don't know about orchestra auditions, that you can send I set, I won't shout them out, but one orchestra that I used to play with, a big well-known orchestra, I would sit in on some of their auditions sometimes, and we'd listen to 150, 200 musicians, literally that many, and at the end of 3 days, no one gets the job.
Yeah.
And that was just the most ridiculous thing to me.
It's a huge, huge problem in
Yeah.
the industry, and it is discussed unceasingly. I mean, I think sometimes because orchestras are such clubby organizations and because there is so much secrecy around process, I think there's sometimes the perception that orchestras are just fine with the fact that no higher auditions happen. I know very few people who are fine with it.
Yeah.
I know even fewer people who have a solution for it.
Mm.
A lot of people have things that they think will help. I have things I think would help, but it's a really imperfect process. I think one of the real challenges of the audition process is to a large extent, we have made the process blind, or at least partially blind, by putting up screens between the people auditioning and the committee that's judging them. Usually the screen will come down at some point in most orchestras, either for like a chamber music round or just because a lot of musicians really do feel very deeply that there are elements of playing that need to be assessed visually and you need to be able to see them. Other people think that's not the case. It's very hotly debated.
Yeah.
But when you make the audition blind, I have had there's a musician in my orchestra, a principal player who I respect very deeply, who feels passionately that audition committees behind a screen judge the candidates far more harshly, and that they nitpick more, and that they don't think of them as humans. They think of them as just this collection of
Just the
sounds
sound.
coming at you.
Yeah.
And having been on committees that didn't use a screen and committees that do, I actually think he's right about that. Personally, I don't think that rightness outweighs the benefit of the screen,
Yeah.
which is in eliminating various levels of implicit bias or explicit bias. But I do think he has a really good point.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, when I won my job in Knoxville, the curtain came down on the finals, and so there could be a play with the principal sort of round, and that's what put me head over ahead of everyone else, was the synergy that I could immediately create with this person that I had never met before. It's really important. But something I want to jump to, Scott, in the prelude. We talk a lot about a relationship between a principal player and a non-principal player. And Sam, earlier, you touched on the fact that winning an audition is a big moment, despite the orchestra and despite the position within that orchestra. So I'm curious if once you got your job with the Minnesota Orchestra, months, maybe even a year or so down the line, were there these moments of, wow, this isn't as magical as it seemed when I won this job, considering I don't get to play this, or I'm not in the spotlight for this? Because I think it's safe to say that when a musician wins an audition, that musician in their schooling and their training, they're usually close to the top of the pack. I was certainly a principal player primarily until I won my job as a second bassoonist. So that was, an adjustment for me. I guess that's my long way of asking, are there adjustments that you didn't quite see in the big exciting moment of having won this job with such an important, American orchestra?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's always going to be adjustments, even if you were the most eyes wide open musician in the world, and you came in with no false preconceptions about what the industry was, which most of us have at least a few.
Yeah.
There's still going to be that period of adjustment because every orchestra plays differently. The Alabama Symphony plays differently than the Minnesota Orchestra, plays differently from the Cleveland Orchestra. I went to Oberlin and studied with, among other people, Cleveland Orchestra musicians,
right,
as well as my main teacher. And the Cleveland Orchestra has an incredibly particular sound and an incredibly particular style, and they teach that. And it is incredibly effective at winning auditions. Because they stress precision, and they stress really precise dynamics, and just sort of getting everything technically right, which that can be a real advantage in an audition, because even though in the end what's probably going to get you the job is your musical personality, what's going to get you tossed out early
is missing the B natural.
Exactly. Yeah. And this is one of the things when we were talking about, the problems with auditions, this is one of the things we go back and forth on. And actually, I've talked about this with my principal in Minnesota, Rebecca Albers. She feels so strongly that the focus is too much on these little technical bits and pieces, and that we sometimes miss the bigger picture of how someone creates a phrase or how they interpret a line, and that we somehow need to find a way to put more of the focus on that and less of the focus on, did they snap that rhythm exactly, precisely, metronomically correctly. But in the moment, if you're sitting on that audition committee and you're listening to someone play those excerpts, and someone biffs the same rhythm 5 times in a row,
right,
in the back of your head, you're going, I don't know if I want to sit next to that for the next 20 years.
Right.
But maybe we shouldn't be saying that, because there's always something, right? No matter who you're working with, if you're sitting shoulder to shoulder, it's a job. There's going to be something about that other person that irritates you, and something about you that irritates them. And that's life.
Who's your stand partner again?
We rotate. We rotate. So we rotate the irritation.
Okay.
But like, you're always going to have that, right? So that's part of being an adult. It's not music camp. It's not, your group lessons as a kid. This is your job. And part of your job is getting along with your coworkers and working together and acknowledging that none of you are perfect.
Yeah.
And one of you asked about adjustments when I got in the orchestra. One of the biggest adjustments I had to make is that I was trained in this Cleveland Orchestra style. I love the Cleveland Orchestra. If you asked me hand to heart what's the best orchestra in America, I would probably say the Cleveland Orchestra. I adore them. The Minnesota Orchestra plays with just the house opposite style of Cleveland, and that was a really rough adjustment for me. Not that I didn't want to make the adjustment. It's not that I was against adjusting. It was that I literally could not figure out how to do it. For the longest time, it involved... I had never before been told that I wasn't loud enough. I had always been a pretty loud player as a violist, I thought, and I got here and I felt like I was constantly being told no one could hear me. And that was baffling to me. And it's one of those things where it really requires somebody else to sort of cut through your own BS in your head and point out to you the obvious, which is, so play louder.
Yeah.
I spent all this time dithering over, well, I mean,
Do I need a new bow?
Right. Is it my bow stroke? Is my instrument bad? Am I not? It's like, just play louder, but otherwise the same. Because we get in our own heads as musicians about our shortcomings. And I had so many shortcomings. I was incredibly lucky that I won my job in Alabama at 22. I won my job in Minnesota just before I turned 24.
Oh, wow.
And
that's an accomplishment, yeah.
You can say that, but the downside of it is I was still such an incomplete player. They obviously saw something they liked, and I'll be forever grateful for that. But I felt so out of my depth, not so much with colleagues, because everyone, Minnesota is a really supportive orchestra by and large. The people are really great about sort of treating it like it's a family and trying to be supportive of each other. But I could feel where I was falling short.
Yeah.
And I really agonized over it to, frankly, a ridiculous extent. I mean, in a way that had I gotten the job in my 30s, I might have had a little more, just a little more common sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
But as it was, everything felt like a crisis for that first year and a half, 2 years.
Sure.
I think we've been talking about imposter syndrome lately.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Or Dunning-Kruger,
and the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Yeah.
Do you know the Dunning-Kruger effect?
I love the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Okay, so that's something that I think everybody chews on at some point in time in their career or another. And I think that it's amazing that it happens so much in classical music that you never see it. Everything from the composers who are, they have this incredible piece of music and they're going, oh, I don't know if they're going to like this part about it. And to hear that the musicians are going through it too, to me, that's sort of, I feel a little vindicated.
Well, and how could you not? Because if you look at the central ridiculousness of this profession is that it is entirely subjective, right? Because it's music. Music is subjective. It's highly personal. There's no, this is 100% correct, this is 100% incorrect. That's not how it works. And yet we judge it as if it is objective.
Yeah.
And we do that in competitions. We do that in auditions. We do that when we listen to music and recordings. We go on social media and we make blanket statements about artists who we've decided we do or we don't like. And we say these things as if our opinions are somehow fact-based when they are not at all. And when you decide to work in that world, that contradiction is going to get you at some level. Some people handle it better than others. Some people handle it by never acknowledging that there's a contradiction. Some people coast through their entire careers acting as if we can say that these things are objective. But then, the deeper you get into, say, the planning and the programming side of things, you start to have a responsibility to acknowledge that contradiction, because it's that sort of treating the subjective as objective that leads to things like how narrow the canon has become, and leads to the exclusion of certain composers, and leads to the exclusion of musicians, and leads to generations of male musicians claiming that women can't do the job, and leads to all manner of racism and any number of other things. And most of that comes out of people stating subjective opinions as fact.
And it's interesting that you're bringing this up, because as I was going through your Twitter, I also saw you kind of having a back and forth with someone about classical music being the greatest music ever made, or whatever, and how, again, how objectivity is placed on classical music inappropriately, making assumptions about it, as you've said, that lead to certain things that sort of cloud the art form, including, how people even feel going to a concert. So two folks who have been on TRILLOQUY so far, so I posted something on Instagram about, I'm going to hear the Minnesota Orchestra. I was invited by Alpha Dworkin when you guys did the American Rhapsody music of Samuel Coleridge Taylor with words of George Washington overlaid.
And that was put together by Aaron Dworkin, who runs the Sphinx organization, and Alpha, his wife.
Right, yeah. Which, Scott, we'll talk about that piece of music later because I had some issues there. But anyway, when I posted that to Instagram, I'm here seeing the Minnesota Orchestra. These two people who I won't name, for now, just were in my DMs about how could you do that? How could you go hear that orchestra? They don't care about us, what we're doing, about changing things, and it's difficult for me to hear that from people who aren't really in the field, because as many problems as I have with big organizations like the Minnesota Orchestra, at the end of the day, I think we're here, Scott, to remind people that classical music is something that they can engage in, and is
Hmm.
something that can be interesting. But again, there's just this whole cloud around it, and specifically the Minnesota Orchestra, unfortunately. In what ways do you think, as someone who is not a principal player, not the conductor, not, leading one of the administration offices or something, in what ways do you work to sort of change that perception, and to remind folks that, what the Minnesota Orchestra does can apply to just about anyone's life and experiences?
Well, I mean, I think part of it is not going into any interaction with the attitude that we can apply to everyone's experiences as
That's
we
interesting.
currently exist.
That's interesting.
Because it orchestras are big institutions, right? Big, broad-based organizations, multi-million-dollar organizations, and I sometimes think that the sheer
Well,
size
not
of it,
all, but certainly the Minnesota Orchestra.
but many, and
Yeah.
even a small professional orchestra that operates at anything approaching full time is going to be a multi-million-dollar,
Right.
like just by nature of the number of people you have to pay.
Mhm.
And I sometimes think that there's a perception that because these orchestras have large budgets, that means they have stacks of money sitting around in coffee cans, and it's usually
Right.
the opposite of that. It's
Yeah.
just there are so many people involved, and you have to pay them all, and that's why the budget's big.
Sure.
But because they're large, orchestras get tagged as somehow these universal arts organizations.
Hmm.
And I feel like in America particularly, there has been a tendency for the people who work in orchestras to drink that particular Kool-Aid,
Mm.
to assume that because we came up in these musical traditions and we love this music, this core, the Brahms, the Beethoven, the Mozart, whatever, that that's the limit of our responsibility as musicians and artists, is to play that music, and B, that anyone in the world, regardless of where they grew up or what they grew up listening to, should be able to listen to this and love it as we do and appreciate it. And we build up all these myths about the effect that this music can have on children, and and some of it is not entirely myth. Some of it is based on some stuff about kids who grow up listening to music. Generally, there can be some effects on how they do with other kinds of learning, especially if they grow up learning music and studying
Sure.
music. But we twist these things into self-beneficial frames, right? We say that because this is what I do for a living and this is what I care about and what I'm passionate about, therefore it must be universal. And it's not. Nothing is universal. And if we want to attract more people to what we do, it stands to reason that the answer is to broaden what we do, not to expect other people to fit themselves into our, square peg, round hole. And so I think you asked what I can do as a non-principal
Or what
player.
are you doing even?
One of the great things about the way that orchestras run in America is that they are very much these big, messy organizations full of committees. And this varies a lot from ensemble to ensemble. There are ensembles that are extremely top-down, where the management runs things. The musicians might have a few committees that make sure the contract's followed, but otherwise it's just very separate. The Minnesota Orchestra, for at least the last almost decade, has functioned very differently. We went through a very traumatic lockout from 2012 to 2014, and at the end of that, it very nearly destroyed the organization.
Yeah.
And at the end of it, we really had to rebuild from scratch. And the easiest thing to surmise coming out of that lockout was that the organization had been siloed. It had happened deliberately. It had happened for power structure reasons, and that had to be broken down. And in the course of breaking down those silos, what we created was an immensely collaborative model, which is in itself super messy. I mean, I don't want to act like, we created some grand structure that would work for, every other
Sure,
orchestra. It is real messy if you have an organization of a couple hundred people and you suddenly tell them all that they're all equally important in the planning process. But it does lead to a situation where a lot of voices get heard. And we have continued with a lot of the elements of that messy but open planning process. And so for a musician like me, there are opportunities for me to sit on committees that ask difficult questions about what we're playing and why we're playing it, and for me to make a forward-looking case for what we ought to be doing in the coming years. I actually want to ask you, so you talked about the American Rhapsody concert that we did. I have the feeling I know some of what your mixed emotions were about it, but this was I was not involved in the planning of this, but I did play in it. So Aaron Dworkin, obviously hugely respected, figure in classical music who founded the Sphinx organization. Afa, his wife, works with him running it. And he created this piece, this mashup, basically, of the music of Samuel Coleridge Taylor, a fantastic piece, with words, largely the words of George Washington, but also Aaron's own words.
Yeah.
But they were the words of George Washington.
Yeah.
I'm guessing that was probably the first thing that rubbed you the wrong way.
It felt. Did we talk about this at all, Scott?
You and I did a little bit, yeah.
It was just the feeling of forcing the audience. I felt like as an audience member, I was supposed to walk away forgiving George Washington for his proximity to American slavery. I felt like that is what the Minnesota Orchestra was asking me to do. And it definitely upset me. I didn't even stay past intermission, even though one of my favorite composers is Shostakovich, and there was Shostakovich on that concert that I did not stay for because I was that upset. And then when you mix that with what to me looked like the tokenization of black children on stage, it just, for me, it dug that trench even deeper, because I should be one of the people going to the concerts. I have a connection, professional and personally, with classical music. So my question was, what do concerts like that say to the person who doesn't have to have a reason to appreciate classical music? That was really my bone to pick with the organization in that moment. How is this broadening the audience?
And also wondering about the people in the audience, what they actually walked away with.
Right.
Did they get the point that you're talking about? Or did they walk away feeling like, oh, okay, so now all of a sudden I'm supposed to feel better about George Washington?
And the same people giving that piece of music a standing ovation at the end were the same folks side-eyeing what I had chosen to wear to the concert, which was not a blazer and slacks. It was jeans, sneakers, and a Black Lives Matter T-shirt. So that whole, and getting back to the TRILLOQUY guests who were in my DMs about, how could you support the Minnesota Orchestra? It's little things like that from my perspective, just again dig that trench deeper. And I'm not here to slam on the Minnesota Orchestra, but I mean, you asked the question. So that's how I felt walking away from that concert.
No, and I asked the question because I think it's hugely important when large institutions like the orchestra have something that that people perceive as a misfire. We absolutely have to be called out on that. And what's interesting about this particular example, I think, is that it was actually conceived as something that was supposed to have the opposite effect, right? It was supposed to be a celebration of Black lives. It was supposed to be, here was a piece that was literally created by, a man of mixed race and created to celebrate the music of a Black composer, Samuel Coleridge Taylor, not African American. He was English.
Afro-English.
There you are. Yeah. And yet, you are not the only person that I have heard this from about that concert. And also, I'm very curious too. You talked about what you perceived as being the tokenization of Black kids on stage, and I happen to know that the people who planned the concert, the reason they wanted those kids there is because they wanted there to be input from these kids. These were kids from a high school on the north side of Minneapolis that we have a partnership with. And the idea was for them to take these words of George Washington and create a reaction to it of their own. And then to perform that on stage alongside our performance of this piece. And I don't know. I'm hesitating because I don't want to say it was a presentation problem, because I feel like that's minimizing the issue. But I do wonder if there had been a way for us to make more clear that what these kids were there to do was to present a counterpoint.
Sure.
Which, on the other hand, you don't want to disrespect the creator of the other piece.
Of course.
But maybe, yeah. I mean, the fact that you're not the first person I've heard this from means that we don't get to dismiss. That we don't get to dismiss this kind of complaint. This was a thing that I think people thought was going to be very celebratory and that it was going to be a very positive thing. And I think for some people it was.
Yeah.
But for other people it was not. And we have to take that into account. I think classical music has a tendency to say, well, we're never going to please everyone. And that may be true, but that doesn't mean that you don't internalize and you don't react to the criticism in a positive way. And I do think that one of the things, at the risk of blowing smoke up my own employer, I would say we have some people in the very highest levels of the orchestra at this point who absolutely get that and who take it very seriously.
Yeah.
We have had more conversations in the wake of that concert than just about any previous concert I can imagine, because people genuinely do want to understand when we've put a foot wrong.
And that's encouraging for me to hear, because if I may keep it extra trill, a little birdie told me that concert was plan B anyway, that there was a tour planned that didn't work out or fell through, so they're like, oh, well, let's just do this concert instead. Maybe that's just hearsay from the folks I hang out with, but that's also something I understood about that concert, that it wasn't originally planned. It was just the reaction to this thing didn't work out, so let's do this.
I would push back on that just a little bit, in the sense that in the planning process of any season, there are always things that get planned and then for whatever reason don't come to fruition, and then you move other things around.
Okay.
So I would not necessarily say that it's a concert that wouldn't have happened otherwise. That's where it wound. It is true that there was a planned tour that wound up not coming to fruition for just logistical reasons. And so that's where that got slotted in, but I would not necessarily extrapolate that to it wouldn't have happened otherwise.
Yeah.
You talk about the people that are higher up in the organization that are very concerned about these sort of issues, and they're thinking about it purposefully. One of the past opuses of this podcast, we featured Nebal Messoud, and
he wrote that article.
Right. Having people of color in positions to be able to make these choices. Is that happening? Is the management in the upper echelons of this organization becoming more diverse?
Well, it depends what you call upper echelons. Is the upper management
so
becoming more
you
racially...
what you consider to be the upper echelon then?
Well, so there's multiple levels of leadership at an orchestra, right? There's the board, which technically is the highest level of leadership, but is more an oversight thing. Our board has been adding more board members of color over the last several years. Now, is it anywhere close to where it should be yet? No. And this is, I feel like a hugely important thing when we talk about race in classical music is we are constantly asking to be congratulated for the very smallest steps.
Right.
And that it's got to stop. It's not, you don't get to take a step that the rest of the world took 50 years ago and then expect to have your hand shaken for it.
I don't care what you have planned for Martin Luther King Jr. Day.
Exactly.
I want to see that work in April and in December, and
Yes, right. and just it's, if you're doing it for PR reasons, you might as well not be doing it. Right? That's not so. All of that is to say, nothing's where it needs to be, but our board has been making an effort to recruit and bring on board more board members of color. Is our management still entirely white? Yes, it is. is our orchestra still overwhelmingly white? Yes, it is. Even by the standards of American orchestras, we actually have, I'm pretty sure, a lower percentage of Asian American musicians and Asian musicians from other countries than a lot of orchestras. And we have a lot of discussions about why that is. Anecdotally, it seems as if we get fewer Asian musicians at our auditions than some of the big coastal orchestras.
Mm-hmm.
Some of that may just be an element of, if you move to this country and you move straight to New York or LA, you may
That's
be
where you set
loath-
up shop.
or you may just be loath to take an audition in the Midwest,
Mm-hmm.
in an area of the country that is overwhelmingly more white outside, Chicago,
Right.
and certain other cities. So yeah, we are not anywhere close to where we want to be, but where we want to be is one of those open discussions, right? And you so quickly get into the realm where everyone is sort of notionally on the side
Mm-hmm.
of broadening who we are and what we do, but then specific steps rub people the wrong way.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have to get into those very uncomfortable places of, why does this make me uncomfortable? Why do I feel as if this is not what we should be doing? And you really wind up, if you're honest about the process as a white person, you have got to do a lot of self-interrogation.
Yeah.
You have to really query why you believe the things that you believe. You mentioned a while ago during this conversation about, classical music constantly referring to itself as the greatest.
Right.
And this is a thing that I was speaking with someone on Twitter about this week. And it's such an odd thing, because who told you that? At what point in your life did you decide that not just that it's great, not just that you love it, the greatest? Where did that come from? What's your evidence? Have you bothered to acquire any, or is it no, you haven't? It's just someone told you this is the greatest. That made you feel good because you liked it. And so you say that because it feels harmless to you.
Yeah.
But if you're someone from outside that club and you view classical music as this very exclusive thing that is not for you, and they're standing there on their hill that they built, telling you that theirs is the greatest and whatever you listen to is lesser.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of recruiting tactic is this?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's utterly bizarre. Yes, everybody uses superlatives when they talk about music. People who love Beyonce will talk about Beyonce as the greatest of all time.
Well, she is, but
I mean, it's
go on.
hard to argue it. Yeah. But they're generally not going to try to recruit you to I never know, is it Bayhive or Beehive?
It's the Beehive.
Okay, it's the Beehive.
Very much.
They're not going to try to recruit you to
and
the
they're
Beehive.
and they're going to find you on Twitter.
Yeah, I'm not.
You
I'm not
might
worth,
have some bee emojis in your.
I'm not worth their time. But no, they're not going to try to recruit you to the Beehive by talking smack about some other artist. They're
Not
going
all
to talk
the time,
about
but yeah. But I definitely get
You
what
know
you're
what I
saying.
mean.
Yeah.
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 It's not, and this is a real problem in classical music, because when you even talk to musicians about the need to stop using that kind of language, what you get back is what I got back on Twitter the other day from someone who is quite successful in the field and honestly should know better, which was somebody saying, well, how are we supposed to sell the music by saying it's not great? And it's like, well, that's not what I said at all.
Yeah.
I said, stop saying it's the
The
greatest.
greatest. Right.
Yeah.
Stop
Right.
setting it up as above everything else when you have no evidence to back that up.
Mm-hmm.
Something similar happens in the theater realm. Shakespeare's the gold standard, right?
Is Shakespeare the gold standard?
By some people's definition, it's very fine. To be able to be Macbeth, to be
Right.
cast in Macbeth would be like getting concertmaster of the Concertgebouw.
Right, or playing one of our favorite excerpts, as a bassoonist getting to play Shostakovich 9, and all that
Exactly.
sort of thing.
Yeah.
We're running a little long. This conversation is really good, but Sam, I can't let you go without bringing this up. So. In orchestras, there's something called tenure. So after, and it depends on the orchestra, after a certain amount of time or whatever, you have that job, that position is yours. And if they want to get rid of you, there are certain hoops that have to be jumped through. And, it's usually more difficult as a way of, protecting the employee, the musician.
Mm-hmm.
Last year, I spoke with two Minnesota orchestra musicians who do not have tenure, and they weren't comfortable being on TRILLOQUY without tenure. So without me making any assumptions, without me throwing any shade or anything, I just want to know, Sam, from your perspective, is speaking freely on subjects like these, even if they critique the Minnesota Orchestra itself, something that's not really celebrated within the organization? Why do you? I can't ask you to tell me why they didn't want to be on, but does it make sense to you that two non-tenured Minnesota Orchestra musicians would feel nervous about being on a podcast like this?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just because, so the way tenure works in symphony orchestras, in America anyway, like you said, for the first generally year to 2 years, you're on probation,
Right.
which basically means you are not guaranteed employment beyond that at all. You can be dismissed after a year, you can be dismissed after
After
2
a week.
years, and for basically no reason. I mean, it's all laid out in the contract. I mean, they'll give you a reason, but that's not, you have no recourse. You've signed on to a contract that says, I am going to be judged for everything I do for the first 2 years. And when you are in that process, you naturally assume that means everything.
Mm-hmm.
That means you tick off one person, even if they're not on your audition committee or your tenure committee or whatever, in your mind, that could affect your ability to stay in this job. And it's a good job and you want to keep it. So yes, that's absolutely a natural reaction. I know of no situation in my orchestra in which anyone has been disciplined for talking, let alone when they were, actually, you know what? That's not true. There was a period under a much darker administration just before our lockout where I do know of a situation where one of our principal players was hauled in over a totally innocuous quote to the press. But it was shocking when it happened because that was such an unheard of thing.
So maybe the culture of that fear is industry-wide and not just a Minnesota Orchestra issue.
Oh, for sure. I mean, anytime you're on probation, your number one priority is going to be, nose to the grindstone, do your job, react to the criticism that you get, do your best to correct whatever you're told to correct, and at the end of that, hopefully, you will get tenure. And it's not that you can't be fired with tenure. You absolutely can.
Sure.
It just, as you said, it takes a little longer and there's a process, and you have some rights.
Right.
Which is, not that different from a lot of other union contracts. It's a union job. The union's job is to protect its members, and part of that is having these things in place that says, I think it comes out of the old tradition from, the mid-20th century when music directors in America were given just carte blanche to do whatever they wanted. They could replace half the orchestra if they wanted to. Musicians weren't real happy with that, and so now it's swung in a different direction.
Yeah. Well, Scott, I feel like we got a pretty honest, in-depth look into the organization, more so than I thought.
I think so. And I'm curious about your opinion on where it's going. Do you see diversity? Do you see more diversity happening? The effort is at least the effort there past the concert that you talked about with the Washington piece?
And more than just diversity, because that's becoming one of those, words you can tick off to get a pat on the back. So more than just diversity is important, sure, but where do you see it going as far as community relevance and an organization like the Minnesota Orchestra being an institution of the community that it exists in, and not just, again, this thing that sits on the hill that, people with enough money and with a shirt and tie can go participate with?
Yeah, I think as an industry, we are at a real crossroads with this right now. And just to be brutally honest about it, nothing changes in an industry as broad as symphony orchestras without there being a change in priorities. And the change in priorities in this field historically has come about, like the change has come about when the funding community changes its priorities. So in the late 1960s and the 1970s, the Ford Foundation came in and started pouring money into American symphony orchestras for a variety of reasons that made orchestras, even more than they had already been, sort of the center of the classical music world.
Yeah.
They pulled out at some point. Other things replaced it. Other priorities came along. When I first joined the industry, you couldn't get a grant for anything in this business unless it had an education component. That was the big buzzword of the time, that we were going to lose audience if we didn't bring kids into the fold. Everything had to have an education component or it wouldn't get funded. These days, there is a priority in the funding community in the arts for things to get, and I'll just put it the most crass possible way, less white.
Yeah.
And part of that is obviously the funding community is not for the first time, but to a greater extent, funding arts initiatives that are organized and run by people of color. But they would also like the legacy arts organizations to participate in this evolution and to be, as you said, not just more diverse, but more equitable, and to actually do more than pay lip service. We are at the beginning of this as an industry, which is not to say there aren't people working very hard on it. There are, both in my organization and across the country, there are. But the way I tend to describe it to people is, if you've ever lived in a city like Minneapolis, St. Paul, or, smaller cities around the country, if you've ever tried to have a municipal conversation about public transit, it often has to start from the level of, should we have some of that? Whereas in Chicago or New York, that is not where the conversation begins.
Yeah.
The conversation begins there with, oh my God, how do we fix it?
Yeah.
And so it's a whole different kind. And I feel like sometimes our industry starts from, should we have some of that?
Yeah.
Where that puts us behind everyone else's curve. But that's important work to do, in a community like Minnesota, which is largely white. Minneapolis itself less so, but still, as big cities go, Minneapolis is still, I believe, 55% white. Those of us who are white in this profession have a lot of work to do in educating each other and educating our leaders sometimes, but also educating our audience, and not expecting that musicians of color are going to swoop in and do all this work for us.
And then for me, the next step, when it comes to white folks educating each other and having that conversation, you also have to talk about seceding power. Because again, we're talking about people of color, people from marginalized communities in leadership positions. Scott, we've been talking, we've been centering the Minnesota Orchestra in this conversation, but even with our organization, those are conversations that are happening, and most of our leadership roles aren't filled by people of color. So so it's something that's happening everywhere, and just as people can have preconceived notions about an orchestra like the Minnesota Orchestra, the same with organizations like ours. So it's all of our charge to really do the work.
And that conversation about leadership and power is so hugely important, because it goes, I feel like that is a wedge that you can drive into the orchestra world, where you can point out, the one non-white racial group that is quite heavily represented in classical music is Asians, Asian Americans. And yet I have a good friend who's a very prominent Korean American violinist who will point out till she's blue in the face, show me the Asian American leaders. Show me the orchestra that is run by an Asian. You can't. There is this notion of just how far we're willing to let people progress. And it's the history of the way that racism works in this country, that, the small bits are handed out, and then, the white hand that handed them out expects to be thanked. And, if you look, I feel like if you look at the history of the arts in this country, there is that sense of, you're only allowed to progress so far. And it even goes beyond race. One of my favorite ever articles about classical music is this Time magazine article from 1968 that got republished about a decade ago. And it was about this phenomenal new trend of ladies in symphony orchestras. And you can tell from the way this article was written that every man involved, and of course it was written by a man, it quotes almost exclusively men, they all thought they were being the height of progressive.
Yeah, woke.
Oh, they were so pleased with themselves about the fact that now there are women in classical music, and yet in the first two paragraphs, they're describing a woman in the New York Philharmonic as being as curvy as the bass she plays.
Good grief.
She's still in the New York Philharmonic, by the way. She's absolutely badass. And the best quote in that article is from the music director of the LA Philharmonic, a very prominent conductor to this day, who has this amazing quote where he says, well, of course we hire women. My God, it is 1968. Of course we do. Of course, I do cap it at 16 and no title chairs because, you don't want to ruffle feathers. And that's that power thing.
Yeah.
That like, well, of course we have them, but oh, no, you can't. My God, can you imagine if you had a woman at concertmaster?
Right. Goodness gracious. Reminds me of what Pocahontas' dad told the members of his nation. But anyway, so Sam, what, how can, we've talked about your Twitter and all that. So how about you tell folks how they can follow you on Twitter and keep up with your internet escapades?
I'm Viola North on Twitter. I guarantee you it is far more boring than Garrett made it sound. Also, I apologize. There will be hockey tweets. That's just the nature of the beast.
And international snacks.
Yeah.
Very occasionally. So you can follow me there. I also, if you're in Minneapolis, St. Paul, I'm the co-curator of a small performance series called Outpost Words and Music, and you can find that at Outpost MUSMN on Twitter. I think also on Facebook. And I just do a whole lot of stuff around town. So, if you're ever in the orbit, come say hi.
And if someone's listening right now who lives in the Twin Cities or Minnesota and they feel like a Minnesota Orchestra concert is not for them, what would you say to convince them to come give it a try, to come see one of your shows?
I would say that we play about a dozen different kinds of concerts, and I'll bet one of them might be for you, and if none of them are, we need to hear about it. Because if we're not doing something for you, then we are failing in that way.
And who can they contact with that sort of feedback?
We actually have a number of, you can go through the website, you're welcome to just tweet directly at me, and I promise that I will take it to the very highest levels. If there are things that we're doing that just seem wrong to you, like the concert Garrett's talking about, we want to hear about that. Like, there is no one over there who doesn't want to hear when we've put a foot wrong. But we also want to hear about the stuff that we're doing that people are engaging with and do like and do want to see more of, because sometimes it's hard to gauge without getting real invasive with audience members. We want to hear about it when it meant something to you. Check out what's on the schedule at your local orchestra, because it may be more than you think it is. I think we have this notion that orchestras do exactly one thing, or maybe they do two things. They do the classical concerts and the pop shows. It's way more than that at this point. So, look around, see if there's anything for you. And if there's not, demand that there be. By and large, orchestras tend to be the largest arts organizations in their town by budget in most cities. That means there's a responsibility to be responsive to everyone in that town. It doesn't mean they can never be all things to all people. No one can be, but we should at least be trying to serve the community on whose backs we exist.
Exactly.
Agreed.
Exactly. Wow. Well, Sam, thank you so much for being on this opus of TRILLOQUY. We're going to have a little role reversal here. So you brought in a piece of music for us to hear. So how about you act like you're doing our jobs as radio announcers and tell folks what they're about to hear?
Absolutely. So one of my passions is new music, living composers. I play as much of it as I can. And one composer who I've had an ongoing professional relationship with for coming up on a decade now is Judd Greenstein, who is this tremendous composer and musical entrepreneur, originally from New York City. These days he lives in the hills of western Massachusetts, and he and his wife, Michi Wianco, have created this amazing farm/artist retreat where they put on concerts all summer and they bring people out to just sort of bask in the quiet and do their work. And he is also one of the founders of New Amsterdam Records, which is this record label that has really gone a long way towards rejuvenating the new music scene in New York and really nationwide. They put out an ungodly number of releases every year. So the Minnesota Orchestra has commissioned Judd's music. We've played a bunch. I've played a bunch of his chamber music. I just played some this past weekend, actually. And this is a piece that he wrote for solo viola and 6 other backing violas on a recorded track. It was originally written to be played by the great violist Nadia Sirota, and it was part of an art installation at an Arizona art museum. So originally those 6 backing tracks would have been played from 6 different speakers all over a gallery. I have mixed them down to a single track for radio. But yeah, it's basically a solo viola work, and the accompaniment is 6 backing violas, and it's called "In Teaching Others, We Teach Ourselves."